John, good to see you. Thanks for being here today.
Good to see you again, Chris. It's been a while.
It has been a little while, so I want to go ahead and get this thing started so we can learn about air quality management with you. So I'm going to start off with your background for everybody. John Bachmann is principal of Vision Air Consulting LLC. He is now retired after 33 years with EPA Air Programs as the Associate Director for Science, Policy, and New Programs. He is leading the EPA Alumni Association Half Century of Progress project. He was heavily involved working with senators and congressional staff in developing the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act. He has been featured on CNN and PBS, and on top of everything else, he is a talented musician and makes environmentally oriented music. The man, the myth, the legend, John Bachmann, thanks so much for being here today.
Who is that guy? All right. Look, this is going to be for all of you a little early in the sequence of learning about air pollution, and I'm gonna treat you like adults here, and some of this stuff, we'll go into enough detail, but you don't have to know it all. I mean, you're going to learn some of this stuff later in the curriculum. At any rate, this is sort of air pollution 101 in one sense, but it's also pretty heavy duty, and in part because 2020 is a huge year. It's the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which has already passed, and I have a music video on that you can take a look at, and the 50th anniversary of the founding of EPA, which is December 2nd, 1970, 50 years ago, and the Clean Air Act amendments of 1970, which are considered by many to be sort of a landmark change in the whole approach to federal management of environmental protection. And that was actually signed late in December 31st. They worked on New Year's Eve. So this is going to be a look at the origins, the development, and the evolution of clean air programs, starting mainly in the 1960s, a little bit of history, a little bit of what went on in that magic year, 1970, but also what happened since. And a lot of this in great detail. If you're really masochistic, you could take a look at a 50-page paper I wrote on the history of the 100-year history of air pollution in the U.S., including on the ambient air quality standards. This half a century of progress, this half century of progress project that Chris mentioned is available on the web, and we'll show you at the end how to get to it. And if you want to check out this video, just put my name in there with Vimeo and Mother Earth, and you'll find it. Okay. Going to look at in particular the legislation that happened during this time, the policies, the politics of the era, a focus on air quality standards, which are going to be central to know what those are, what worked and what didn't. And I want you to, if you learn nothing else in here, I want you to learn about what accountability is and why it's such a valuable thing to have in not only environmental programs, but any legislative or any federal or state actions. Did what you try to do work is a key question. And then I'll look at the latest in the air pollution accountability studies, which is really dramatic since just in the end of this past June. What's left? What do we have left to do? Continuing challenges for air quality management, and it's no surprise if I tell you that climate is the big one. All right, air pollution programs in 1960. First, since you probably haven't seen this stuff yet, you need to know about two fundamentally different kinds of air pollution. One comes from coal combustion. Sometimes the coal combustion is, in the old days, is completely uncontrolled, so you get the scene you see there in Denora, Pennsylvania in 1948 during an episode. That picture was taken at noon. You have black particles, especially dominated by particles, but also a little sulfur dioxide in it. And if you clean all the particles out, you still have the sulfur dioxide, and it turns out they turn into particles later. So either way, that's a classic old kind of pollution, and it was the first pollution in the the Industrial Revolution was that kind of coal smoke. And it wasn't just industry. People burned coal to heat their homes. And so they got exposed indoors and outdoors. Very, very bad stuff. On this day and the next couple of days in Denora, Pennsylvania, 20 people died. It's a small town. And 40% of the population got sick. And one of the worst episodes in the United States in terms of waking people up that, hey, air pollution isn't just ugly, it's also dangerous to your health. And then the U.S. Is exceptional, and it invented a new kind of smog. In the 1940s and 50s, the Southern California, which was growing, a lot of people moved from the Midwest for the great clean air and everything else in the West. And when they got there were so many of them, and they started to drive these new things everybody was doing, especially after the war, cars. And they found out that later, it took a while, that they started to make this new kind of smog, and it would make people cry. It was different from this coal stuff. They didn't have a lot of coal there. And as it turned out, this is the stuff we now call smog, like in Los Angeles, and it's dominated by ozone and other photochemical oxidants. So important to know those two fundamental kinds of pollutants that are all over the place, especially back then, are what we're going to talk about. Now, what about air pollution programs in 1960? Well, people knew that air pollution was bad, but still in 1960, cities maintained the major air pollution responsibility, and they didn't do much. Some did. Pittsburgh, Denora did something. Pittsburgh did something. Some other cities did something, but and Southern California were doing things. So a bunch of cities had programs, but they weren't very good. Only 8 states had air pollution programs. California, it's California and the 7 doors. 60% of the total was spent by California on air programs. Federal involvement, not so much. Just research, monitoring, state assistance. In fact, the lead agency for air pollution was the Public Health Service, and they just didn't want to get involved running air pollution programs. It was from a lack of understanding of what air pollution is, where it comes from, and also a lack of understanding of what works. At any rate, they did a lot of work in terms of getting data, and that was helpful. 1960s, the kind of transitional era of change, and you're in one now. You see here people that were marching against the war, you have civil rights marches, you have people caring about the environment, and this was the way it was in the 1960s. And there was a growing environmental consciousness. One of the ones you'll learn about, if you haven't already, is the 1962 publication about pesticides and DDT, and how they could cover the earth and kill kill birds far from the sources. Silent Spring, a really important book that got people excited. Here's somewhat, since I was alive in the 60s, I can say these are bad scenes, man. So here's what NO2 looks like, pure NO2. In the upper left corner there, that's a munitions plant. That's a brown cloud. On the right, it's a steel mill. What's the color from? The color is from iron oxide. In the lower left, you can just see you can see blue smoke coming out. Those are small particles coming out, and that's a burning dump. And the one on the lower right is a really important one. This is an unnatural disaster that happened in the Thanksgiving weekend of 1966. Well over 100 people, more than normal, died during this smog, and it was another case of several episodes that occurred in cities in the United States, Birmingham, some other places, but definitely multiple times in New York. They were able to measure increases in daily deaths from people and people going into the hospital because of the high air pollution. So this episode was one of the things that got people's attention, but also this is what it used to look like, guys. It doesn't look like that anymore, but it used to look like this in major American cities and in a lot of areas, and open dumps happened all the time. With people getting upset and excited about it, there were other things going on. They noticed the air pollution, they noticed other things, but they had marches, and then there was the picture of the Earth from the moon. Not really, it was really moonrise, but taken by the Apollo astronauts. There's music like Paved Paradise, Put Up a Parking Lot by Joni Mitchell. It's still around if you want to hear it. People writing songs about pollution. So young people especially starting to notice it, and politicians noticed right away. This guy on the left, Gaylord Nelson, was a senator who decided to take what was being done for anti-Vietnam things and say, hey, let's have a teach-in like that, but let's do it in the environment and educate people about it. As of early 1970, this Time magazine, yeah, they had magazines back then, noted that the environment was the president's new issue. He was really got interested in it. And an ecologist is on the cover. So things were happening then. But what happened next was that whole concept of an Earth Day. Before the internet, they were able to organize such that 20 million people, and if you've been doing bean counts of some of the things that have been happening in the last, year, in essence, or 2 or 3 years in terms of people in the streets, this is a bigger than any of them kind of event. And you can see how people were packed. You can see they're mostly young. They're mostly white. But it was a humongous thing. And in fact, that's kind of where I came in. I was a high school science teacher in Detroit, Michigan at that point. And in 1969, my first year there, I went to a football game. This is not that particular game, but just to show what it looked like. And there was this plume from a power plant that was pretty close by that was coming down, hitting the field. Now let me show you, because these are pictures I took not on that day. I came back later, it didn't have the same effect. But at any rate, that little circle there is around the plume of a Detroit Edison power plant, and the uncontrolled particles and sulfur dioxide were actually hitting the field. And every now and then the quarterback would have a hard time seeing the receiver, but most importantly, and the band comes on and marches just like it's an ordinary school, but they're marching in crap, and I'm sitting there on the bleachers going, this can't be good for these kids. So I started talking to the kids, and the kids say, well, some of us live near plants, and read up a little bit about, this stuff is bad for you, and there's all kinds of other stuff, water pollution. Formed a little environment club. I think we called it SAVE or something like that. And these kids are astonishing. They were amazing. They actually, on their own, I didn't go with them, visited plants, and actually heads of plants let them come in and talk to them and say, how come you're blowing off stuff at night? I'm not sure much changed, but they got their attention. And the kids were interested enough. We're talking about 1969 fall. The following spring, April 22nd, is Earth Day, and Detroit, unlike many other cities, was one of them. These are my kids going to some of the exhibits on Earth Day. Some of it was indoors, some of it was outdoors. And so I brought them there, and that was just like a huge thing. And the more I got inspired by the kids and the more I learned, the more I thought, maybe I can do more goods for these kids by doing something about this crap that they're living in and trying to do something about than teaching them physics or whatever else I was teaching at the time. And I went, I applied to work for EPA, and based on my chemistry and master's degree, they might have taken me in, but they weren't enthusiastic about it. This is like later in 1970, actually 71, when EPA had been formed. So I said, to heck with that. So I went back to school. I got a degree in air pollution, and did a thesis on air pollution in Gary, Indiana. And I went to work for EPA in 1974 and worked there until 2007. One of the things I got to do before it was all over was to help lead a lengthy effort to change the way EPA regulates particulate matter. This picture is EPA Administrator Carol Browner signing a notice authorizing the first standards for fine particles in 1997. These standards have withstood legal challenges and stimulated research that led to strengthening them twice. By the way, that's me with a tie and more hair. It took a lot of work by many of us, but it's certainly what I'm most proud of during my career at EPA. And there's no doubt Earth Day changed my path. It changed a lot of other people's path before that was all over. Those concerns about those episodes in New York and other places and those bad scenes ended up with legislation in 1963, 65, 67, different mechanisms. Let's look at interstate pollution first, New York to Philadelphia kind of things. Let's do some car stuff. Let's do something more. So this stuff happened. They did this. But in 1970 alone, there were a couple of acts first. But after Earth Day, people got even more excited, and EPA was formed to coalesce the Public Health Service and all these other places that dealt with water and solid waste and everything else in one agency called the Environmental Protection Agency. And as I said, the Clean Air Act amendments in 1970 were passed in December 31st. This is William Ruckelshaus being sworn in as the first administrator of EPA in December 1970. I got to spend some time with him when he came back to the agency in the 1980s. He was a great man. He just died last year. I want to start with, since the Clean Air Act was passed in the end of 1970, I want to start with what was the key way that the Clean Air Act had to do something about air pollution? What was different about it? And this is, we call it a wheel, whatever. It's a process that pushes accountability, and I'm going to explain what that is. But there's a circle, and I think it's really important to point out that the center of the circle is scientific research. Turns out we had to learn a lot about air pollution and the health effects of air pollution and the effects on acid rain and other things as we went along. We didn't know everything there was to know, but the very fact this program existed made that research happen, and EPA funded some of that research. So let's take a look at how the Clean Air Act works for air pollution in general as a superstructure for these kind of air pollutants. Number one, EPA sets science-based national standards for something called criteria pollutants. These are pollutants that come from a lot of different sources, like cars and trucks and power plants and whatever, fire, and they are all over the place. They're not just in one location. There are special provisions for particularly toxic substances like benzene that are less ubiquitous. So EPA established these goals. Who meets them and how do you meet them? Well, first, states are going to be charged with the heavy lifting in terms of, let's see if we've met this goal already. And in many cases, states meet the goal right off the bat. But in other cases, there are many states, many cities do not. So states have to monitor the air pollution to see whether or not they were having a problem. If they were having a problem, they also got inventories together to figure out what the emissions were, where they were coming from, and they would try to use new air quality models to figure out, well, if we do A, B, C, and D, can we meet the standards based on our models? And then, once you've decided what the strategy to meet the pollution level is, the state has to develop a program to actually achieve it. So the state develops an implementation plan. EPA has the authority to review the plan to make sure it's adequate. But at the same time, EPA also helped by setting national technology-based standards for vehicles and new major sources. And the one you will certainly know about already, you have catalytic converters on the cars, unless you have an electric car, it doesn't need one. In fact, these converters are there because of a federal mandate, and there's one state, California, that also mandates these, and some other states that do as well now. But at the time, EPA started out pushing a national program to reduce volatile organic chemicals and nitrogen oxides, especially from automobiles and cars and trucks, and diesel particles before it was all over. So this makes this program one that's by design goes after trying to meet the standard. I'm trying to make sure that I'm below the standard. If I'm not, I'm pushing down. But you're getting some help from we should just control these sources because they're everywhere, and cars can drive from one city to another. They all ought to be clean. That was the philosophy. Then you implement, you get sources to comply with the rules. So what had to happen for all this to happen, just to get to this point? The states had to get people together and hire people. In 1970, by 1970, every state had a program. Remember, it was only 8 in 1960. By 1970, those earlier acts caused there to be state programs everywhere in the country. Still, California was the best at the time. But nonetheless, a lot more programs, a lot more people hired, a transformation in state and federal expertise. Then the sources had to do the same thing. Hey, the head of a plant goes, hey, we're supposed to reduce particle emissions by 50%. What do we do? Well, they didn't have anybody who knew anything about that. They had to hire people, environmental engineers, and so in other words, it created a bunch of jobs for people in industry to figure out what to do about air pollution. Of course, in other cases, they hired lawyers to try to keep from having to do these regulations. But nonetheless, that kind of thing. The sources had to comply, and then the states, followed by EPA, had to go to make sure they did what they said they were supposed to do. That's not enough. In air quality management, the key thing to get accountability is, okay, I did the monitoring. We had a problem. We figured out what we ought to do to meet it. We implemented it. Did it work? Well, the only way you know if it worked is if you monitor it. So if you don't check to see, did the air pollution get better? Then you don't know. You might see a visible improvement or something like that, but the bottom line is you track and evaluate the results. Let's say it didn't all work and you needed to do more. You got to go through the wheel again. And then every now and then we find out new information about the health effects of some pollutant and the standard gets tightened. And then people that used to meet the standard have to do more. So this thing cycles back and forth, which is why that article I wrote some time ago, Will the Circle Be Unbroken, is named that. So at any rate, this is the core approach, the philosophy behind doing technology-based standards and health and risk-based standards, and keeping this process with a federal and a state and a local area role and industry. So I want to do what the air program does. I want to evaluate U.S. air pollution programs before and after 1970. We don't have time to do a full evaluation, but I want to do a little bit of that. I want to address these questions. Before 1970, was it necessary for the federal government to intrude, as the Public Health Service might have said, into the business of cities and states? Was that really necessary? And weren't cities and states and economic developments already going to take care of this all by itself? And what problems were they missing? That's the first set of questions. So what was happening before 1970? And then you ask, after 1970, when the federal government came in with programs, and all 50 states had them, EPA organized around doing things, and as I've already said, industry hired people, and did it work? And I'll just give away the answer. The early actions brought some significant health and environmental benefits, but scientific research and monitoring pointed to where improvements in setting the standards themselves and what pollutants needed to be controlled were needed. And in some cases, people didn't do what they were supposed to say, and you had to take them to court over it. And in some cases, people couldn't do things in the deadlines, the Clean Air Act. I haven't even talked about deadlines in the Clean Air Act, but there's deadlines for all of those things. They didn't do it in time, and in some cases, the Act itself had to change to reflect reality. All right, so let's take a look at real evaluation. Let's start with particles. Particles were measured at the time with basically a vacuum cleaner motor and a big rectangular filter on top of it, and you weighed it, and we had numbers. So let's look at the progress. I'll just say, do you see the cursor here? Good. All right, I'm putting the cursor on the era before 1970, and especially this era between 1960 and 1965. And you look at that, you had 122 sites during that period, and it kind of messed around. It wasn't doing much for quite a few years. As it turns out, some of those early programs got some people that had problems to do things in these 122 sites. But then, when EPA was formed and requirements for new monitors came out to all areas, there were 1,109 sites. So a lot more places are playing now to look at this. So it's more important to notice that these levels here are lower, not just because they got lower, but because there's a lot more areas, and some of them cleaner, that had a lower national average level. So this is a national average level. But notice that after 1971, because EPA couldn't act immediately, there that arrow is, things kept getting better. It gets funky after this because things changed in the way the measurements were taken, but things initially for the first 10 years or so really did make a difference. Somebody took a look at infant mortality in places that were above the standard before when the standard was set, and actually did controls to make it go lower, versus places that were below the standard and didn't do anything, and saw a larger reduction in infant mortality in the places where people were doing things to reduce particulate matter. So a suggestion right there that there were some health benefits. What about the other big pollutant from coal smoke, sulfur dioxide? There were 32 national sites set up by the Public Health Service and for these years. And I can tell you that if you look at this particular annual average, the standards that were most important were short-term. Don't worry about the standards and the concentrations. Just look from 64, 65, 66, still that flat line. Things weren't happening. And they started to happen after that. And they kept on happening. And they particularly happened in big cities. And as it turns out, people fuel switched to get away from coal, used oil or used lower sulfur coal or whatever. But it did work. Things were happening. And this suggests that those early studies and rules actually did something, but it continued after the 70 amendments were passed. So now I'm going to look at a different way to look at accountability and look at things. This is estimated sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide emissions. Sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide emissions come from two sources. The biggest was coal combustion for SO2, and nitrogen oxides came from that, but also any combustion, including automotive combustion. So let's take a look at the difference between the way the pattern goes. I would argue that if you know anything about the economy and you look at SO2 emissions, it turns out that the SO2 emissions tracked things that were going on in the economy. Here's a Great Depression, and industry went down, and people may have used a little less coal in their homes as well, but whatever, there was a big drop in sulfur dioxide at this point, okay? Whereas there was a continuing increase during the Industrial Revolution. So it went down. Then the U.S. comes out of the recession and starts to gear up for World War II. A lot more industries, Rosie the Riveter, all that, big industry came back, coal came back, emissions go up again. Okay, so now air pollution and the economy is linked together in an unholy way. We don't want it to be. When we got to have a better economy, we have to have more air pollution. One thing that happened after that is some of those big cities like, that Pittsburgh and others, they did things to control some of those pollutants locally. And so, and people started to switch to burning natural gas. Who wants to burn coal if you don't have to shovel it in and you can use gas or oil to do it? So the part of SO2 that came from where people lived went down. But then it started to go up again. Well, why? Because a lot of people switched to electricity, and the power plants were burning coal. They burned it cleaner. They didn't have as many particles coming out, which is good, but they put out every bit as much as SO2 as other coal. So as the economy grew, that SO2 emission went up and up and up, and I submit that it would not have gone down when it went down in 1975 or so if it hadn't been for the Clean Air Act causing things to turn around. Let's look at nitrogen oxides. Different picture. You can see a little bit of the Great Depression here, but you also see it kind of going up and up and up and up. What was going on at that time? More and more cars, especially after World War II, a big uptick in the amount of vehicles. And so a lot of this growth in nitrogen oxides was all about motor vehicles. And again, didn't really go down quickly, even by 1980, but it flattened out. And it would have continued to go up if there hadn't have been national standards for automobiles. So this is another indication from data we have that when the Clean Air Act got passed, things changed. Let's talk about some other things that changed. When you take when you regulate cars with a catalytic converter, they early found out that if you use leaded gas, and you may not be familiar, but all gas starting in the 1920s or 30s had lead added to it to make the fuel burn better. And it was called anti-knocking. It turns out the catalyst was poisoned by lead, so EPA had to regulate lead or those catalysts wouldn't have worked. And they also know lead's bad. It's bad for kids. In fact, it reduces IQ, it has serious neurotoxic effects, and this is a trend line of the blood lead level in the highest, most exposed kids. That's the 95th percentile. These are going to tend to be inner city kids, especially living near highways, and the stuff went down into the dirt, and the dirt, kids get dirt in their mouth and things like that. So they got lead from breathing it, and they got it from the dirt that they lived in. And then here's the average kids, and so the There's no real safe level for lead, but the reference level, they like to get everything below, is 5. So here is, this arrow here shows where EPA did its first phase down of lead in gasoline. Boom, you start a big decrease. A second phase down in lead and gasoline. A third phase down in lead and gasoline. And by this time, a new law, a Toxic Substances Act, came out, and we took the lead out of paint because some kids were getting lead from the paint in their homes. And so those regulations caused lead to continue to go down right through 2010. 2 different laws pulling together to get dramatic reductions in a very serious effect, and you can measure it in kids' bloods. Okay, well, what did that catalyst do for the worst air pollution in the country, which was, as far as photochemical smog, was Los Angeles. Let's look up here in the 1976 or so. Catalysts just were coming online, and they got implemented slowly. Why were they implemented slowly? Because they didn't make people tear their car apart and add a catalyst to it. They said all new cars after 1976 or 75 actually had to have a catalyst, and so that only new cars. So not everybody switches cars every year, so it takes a while for the full fleet to change over. But notice that what started to happen in Los Angeles, the worst place in the country, in terms of the number of days above one of the older ozone standards, started to go down. The number of days and also the actual maximum concentrations. So all these things started to go down, but that's not all that was going on in Los Angeles. In the Southern California area, they were doing controls, some of the best controls in the country, on oil refineries, industries, they ended up doing consumer products like paints and backyard barbecues and all kinds of things to get this continuous progress right through 2012. Amazing. They never met the standard, but they made tremendous progress and helped improve health. So this stuff did, in fact, work. What about the rest of the country and ozone? So let's forget about 1970s and look at just 1980 to early 1990s. This is the average concentration for all monitors of the then 1-hour ozone standard. And the white line is the average. This is the 95th percentile, so the worst monitors, like in LA, would be like this, and other places. And the best monitors would be down here, the 95th percentile the other direction. So this is sort of a trend line. And yeah, it's kind of going down, but it peaked up in 1988. It was horrible, and especially in the eastern United States, and people are going, what? You know, none of the stuff that's working out in California seems to be working out here in the east the way we thought it would. What happened? And it was very clear to everybody that from the perspective of that time, 1989 and 1990, the air quality management wasn't working. In fact, by 1990, there was 100 areas that didn't meet the standard. That was a problem. And I'll just give you a hint. We figured out that it turned out we hadn't been controlling some of what the most important pollutants were. But I want to show you one other thing for another standard, a different way of looking at it, the standard more like the one we have now. It also had a peak in 1988, and it also looked flat as you went into the early 1990s. Well, this is really bad. So we'll get to how come this happened. So if you look from 1980 to 1994, we're looking pretty good in the 1970s. You know, smog went down in the dirty cities, PM went down, some other things, sulfur dioxide went down, but unfinished business. One I haven't really brought up, acid rain. Acid rain was starting to be recognized as a big issue, especially in the eastern United States where lakes were turning acidic, that fish were dying, fish were getting increased levels of mercury in them, partly because of the acidity of the water, and people were worried about how that affected trees and ecosystems. Nothing was being done about it on purpose. And it came from sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides. Ozone, what happened? They had to rethink and reanalyze and start to look at it. And it turns out in the eastern United States, in the summertime, plants, vegetation everywhere, forests all over the eastern United States, emits VOC. Enough VOCs that what humans emitted didn't make nearly as much difference as it did in California, where there wasn't as much of that stuff. And as it turns out, we weren't controlling in the east nitrogen oxides. So the controlling pollutant for ozone turned out to be, at least in the region overall, nitrogen oxides. And we weren't doing anything about it. So we needed to fix that, and so science tells you something new, you gotta respond, like today. The new science also suggested there should be stronger standards for ozone and also stronger standards for particles. But as far as implementation is concerned, we needed to do regional, because we found out that the smallest particles were most important, and the ones that, like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide, in addition to making ozone with nitrogen oxides, turned into small particles as they moved along in photochemical smog. So we had a new kind of pollution here, a particle formed from gases. And we have diesel emissions, which people weren't doing as much about. You've seen pictures of diesel buses pumping out stuff. They're a lot cleaner now. So those are things that we needed to do something about. Well, the current Clean Air Act at the time, it was amended in 1977, I didn't go into it, didn't have enough horsepower to do some of the things we needed, and we needed stronger standards for vehicles too. The vehicle standards weren't enough. They weren't enough for nitrogen oxides in particular. So this was an impetus to go back to work, and I got to go to Washington, as Chris already told you, and see how sausage was made. And you can ask your government professor or teacher what that means. At any rate, let's look at how those amendments, which changed everything on how we regulated pollution, worked. Here's national sulfur and nitrogen oxide power plant emissions. Those were the big source of acid rain. They're a big source of particles. They're a big source of ozone. So focusing on them turned out to be important. And acid rain program was implemented under the Clean Air Act amendments, beginning with this phase 1 in 1995. Started to see a little tick down. There was a phase 2 in 2000, more of a tick down. Then the other things that happened during this time, before I finish this curve, is we did, in fact, in 1997, tighten the ozone and particulate matter standards, which led people to do more about implementation. And the ozone policy, implementation policy, caught up with the science. We realized we need to do a regional control program for nitrogen oxides from power plants, and those got implemented roughly in 2002 or so. And so you can see, and these projections, by the way, turned out to be true. I used an old slide here because it's clear as in others that I have. But the nitrogen oxide emissions continued to go down, and the additional controls that we put on to meet fine particle standards caused these power plant emissions to go down. There's also issues with air toxics. There's no time to cover it today, but it's important. So what happened as a result of all this great stuff? These criteria pollutants, all of them went down, by the way. You can see every criteria pollutant, there's 6 of them, but there's more than 6 standards. Lead is one of them, as well as carbon monoxide. You've heard of that. But different kinds of particles. So I want you to look at the weirdly colored, EPA did this, lime green ozone trends. You can see 1990, kind of flat. It never did get better. And until we actually turned on those controls roughly in 2002, things were kind of flat. Then they started to go down. Now, what is this? What am I showing you here? This is relative to the standard. The standard is, if you meet the standard, you'd be below this line. This is the average of all monitors. So if you're below the standard, like right here, right where my arrow is here, probably a lot of monitors are above the standard. The dirtiest ones are above the standards. The cleanest ones are way below it. So, but the bottom line, the average monitor dipped a little bit below the standard by 2009. Part of that was because of the recession, by the way, so we can't take full credit for an economic downturn. But the controls continued and finally started to stay below the standard. Hasn't gotten much better since, maybe recently, maybe not, but at least there's some indication that we kept the average in the country below the 8-hour standard that we have today, and that standard's tougher than the older standard. So this is a big deal. What about PM? The PM standards, the annual standards that we have today, were set in 2012, 2013, and the SO2 reductions and NOx reductions and diesel reductions all reduced fine particles dramatically as time went by. So that's a big deal. I mean, we actually did what we were supposed to do, and when we adjusted the science and even tightened the standards to reflect the idea that people were either dying or getting sick or otherwise being affected by ozone and particulate matter at lower levels than we thought before, we actually met tougher standards than people back in the 1960s said, nobody will ever meet these standards. And every time we tighten the standards, people say nobody will ever meet these standards, and we come through it. Now, I won't say we meet it all the time in Los Angeles. That's a tough place to do it in. But so we had some tremendous things happen here. First of all, by the way, notice that we have not a linear scale here. We've compressed 1970 to 1990 or so, and then after that we've stretched out recent. So a lot happens here. Here's the economy. Goes up. You can see when the recession happened, economy went down a little bit, then it kept going up. This is vehicle miles traveled. Vehicle miles traveled went down a little bit. People stopped driving as much, like they did in the beginning of the COVID recession, but then continued to go up. So all these things went up. Population went up. Energy consumption went up, and then it started to go down, interestingly. So with all these trends, the emissions of the 6 major air pollutants, you know, carbon monoxide and particulate matter, ozone, all these things, went down by 77%. What were the benefits? Okay, well, the benefits were significant. Don't run home with these numbers, but the bottom line was, if you just look between 1970 and 1990 and evaluate the reduced mortality, improved visibility, other health effects, there were trillions of dollars of benefits and billions of dollars of cost, $500 billion in cost cumulative during that entire 20-year period. So benefits were much greater than cost. What about afterwards? What about from 2020 to, I mean, from now till 2020, from continuing on 1990 to 2020? These include forecasts because, you know, 2020 isn't over yet, and they won't be particularly fully accurate. But the benefits, $2 trillion a year. Again, it's probably a bit smaller than that. Annual cost of $65 billion a year. It's smaller because this is per year. And I'll also point out that CO2 started to go down around here when we, partly with the recession, but partly with new standards for vehicles and standards for power plants that didn't fully get implemented. But nonetheless, not much. It hasn't gone down much. But air pollution, regular air pollution, did go down a lot. What about accountability science? What am I talking about, accountability science? On the left, I've told you about fine particles. Fine particles, we have dozens and dozens of studies that show fine particles are associated with premature mortality, especially with older people. There's a map of the square kilometer grids of the average concentration of fine particles in the United States in the year 2000. And the figure below, and you can see the scale. If you get up, you can get up to 16. You can get down to close to 0. But the bottom line is very clear where lots of power plants and people are. We had an awful lot of particulate matter. If you look at what it looked like by 2016, you can see a dramatic reduction, getting rid of almost all of these darker areas above 12, which was the standard at the time, and still is. 15 actually was the standard at the time in 2000, but by the time we got to 2012, it was 12. So well below that. Average in the country now is 8, but that includes areas over here and over here. California's got the worst problem still, and real issues, but even they got much better. So did that do any good? Well, this figure is from a study that estimated these things, and it just got published. Probably the most powerful air pollution study that's ever been done. I'm not overselling this thing. This is accountability science. This is going beyond just measuring, but let's look at the evaluation of long-term exposure to fine particles on mortality among the elderly. So these people from Harvard got 65 million people involved in a study. These people were all on Medicare. They went to the Medicare database. They looked at when they died, how often they died in 2000, how often they died in 2016, and they used multiple methods. Don't worry about the gobbledygook there, but they used methods that were beyond the typical air pollution study, which looks at an association between air pollution and effects. This one actually looked at causality. This one looked at techniques that let you say, we're gonna compare what happened here with another area that had similar characteristics, but the levels didn't go down. And they found the following when the refined particles were used. They looked at 5 different ways to look at it. They concluded that long-term fine particle exposure is causally related to mortality. That's a huge deal. And the effects were similar to the effects that in earlier studies, you remember those numbers, those trillions and so forth? Those numbers came from studies that we had at the time. We didn't have this one, but the kind of, per concentration effect, the dose that gives you, or the exposure that gives you an effect Y of an exposure X, is similar. The relationship between a decrease in this study and a decrease that was used in the other studies, pretty similar. So you have a lot of reason to think that tens of thousands of people's lives were prolonged by half a year, whatever, by these actions. So that gives us a whole lot more confidence than we had. We had a lot of confidence before, but significant new evidence here. And I wanted to, this is like off the presses. This is really new stuff. So, okay, that's it, basically. We've made a lot of progress, but frankly, the standards aren't tight enough, probably. Certainly the particulate matter standards aren't. But continued improvements are needed to maintain and increase the benefits we've gotten so far and ensure they're distributed fairly to all Americans. And we're talking about environmental justice here, because it turns out in some of these studies, we find out that the risk of dying for people that are Latin Americans or black, in fact, are 1.5 to 2 times higher than for white people. And that's because in often cases, they have poor access to health sources, but for particulate matter, they tend to live in the middle of a city or near a power plant or near some kind of other thing, so they may have high exposure. So at any rate, that's what we're talking about there. International transport. Turns out ozone is now going around the world, partly because of methane, which is yet another gas that's associated with the climate, but it makes ozone, and the background levels of ozone today are much higher, more than double what they used to be before the Industrial Revolution. So international transports, now as we get to lower standards, becoming a bigger deal. Climate change, I've already said. Drought and fires. Here is just last year's wildfires. We're having more already in California. The Apple Fire, not as big as this one. And this thing here from a government study that shows as of the cumulative effect of wildfires if there were no climate change versus wildfires that we actually had. And it's a significant increase. Well, why do wildfires get caused by climate change? Because you have droughts in places that aren't used to as many droughts. And the more droughts you have, the more dry it is. Then you might have an increased rain, and there's some undergrowth that grows up, and these fires happen. You also have more floods and other things. Warming-induced stagnation causes air pollution levels to go up. In fact, those tree emissions I mentioned go up. As it gets warmer and warmer, those trees emit more of those volatile organic chemicals, and that mixes with the NOx and makes more ozone. So climate strategies that will improve climate and cool things, turn out to go after the very fossil fuels that are the source of a lot of the problems, and they will benefit air quality. So that's another bottom line, but these are the major challenges that I may not be around to see it all work out, but you guys are going to be around to see what happens and help make some of it happen. That's it, Chris.
Wow, excellent. Thank you so much for that. That was a powerful discussion there. So there's a lot of questions, a lot of meat that you sort of put on the table.